Ellie had always found solace in the forest. The dense canopy, the rustle of leaves, and the occasional glimpse of wildlife made her feel alive. After a stressful week at work, she decided to spend her Saturday hiking a new trail she heard about from a friend. It was supposed to be beautiful, but less traveled. She arrived at the trailhead early in the morning, the sun barely peeking over the horizon. The air was crisp and the forest was still. Ellie secured her backpack, checked her water bottle, and set off. The trail was narrow, winding through tall pines and thick underbrush. As she walked, the sounds of civilization faded, replaced by the chirping of birds and the rustling of small animals in the undergrowth. After about an hour, Ellie came across a fork in the trail. The main path continued straight, but a narrower, less defined trail branched off to the left. Curiosity got the better of her, and she decided to take the less traveled path. She walked for another 30 minutes, the trail becoming increasingly difficult to follow. The trees grew closer together, their branches intertwining overhead, casting deep shadows on the ground. Ellie stopped to take a drink of water and check her map. She realized she had strayed far from the marked trails, but she wasn't worried. She prided herself on her sense of direction and her ability to navigate the wilderness. She decided to keep going, convinced that the path would eventually loop back to the main trail. As she walked, she noticed a change in the atmosphere. The forest seemed quieter, almost too quiet. The birds had stopped chirping, and even the rustling in the underbrush had ceased. Ellie felt a shiver run down her spine. She brushed it off, attributing it to her imagination, and pressed on. Suddenly, she heard a noise behind her. She turned quickly, but saw nothing. The forest was dense, and visibility was limited. She took a deep breath and continued walking, but the uneasy feeling lingered. She couldn't shake the sense that she was being watched. After another hour of walking, Ellie came across an old, abandoned cabin. It was hidden deep in the forest, covered in moss and vines. The windows were broken, and the door hung off its hinges. She hesitated, but her curiosity got the better of her. She approached the cabin, stepping cautiously on the creaking wooden porch. Pushing the door open, Ellie peered inside. The interior was dark and musty, filled with old, decaying furniture. She stepped inside, her footsteps echoing in the empty space. As she explored the cabin, she found remnants of the previous occupants, old photographs, a dusty journal, and broken pieces of furniture. She picked up the journal, brushing off the dust. The entries were dated from decades ago, detailing the lives of a family who had once lived there. The last entry was unsettling. It spoke of strange noises in the forest and a feeling of being watched. The final sentence sent a chill down her spine. "We are not alone in these woods." Ellie's unease grew. She decided it was time to head back to the main trail. As she stepped out of the cabin, she noticed that the forest had grown even darker. The sun was setting, and she realized she had lost track of time. She quickened her pace, trying to retrace her steps. But the forest seemed different now. The path she had taken was no longer clear, and the trees seemed to close in around her. Panic began to set in as she realized she was lost. The silence of the forest was oppressive, and every snap of a twig made her jump. Ellie took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. She had been in difficult situations before and had always managed to find her way out. She would find her way out of this one too. With renewed determination, she set off in what she hoped was the direction of the main trail. But as the darkness deepened, Ellie's confidence waned. She stumbled through the underbrush, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed, that someone, or something, was watching her from the shadows. She stopped to catch her breath, looking around for any sign of the trail. That's when she heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from the darkness behind her. Ellie's breath caught in her throat as she strained to see through the encroaching darkness. The growl echoed in her ears, setting a wave of fear crashing over her. She took a cautious step backward, her eyes darting around for any movement. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. The forest remained silent, save for the pounding of her own heart. She decided to keep moving, pushing through the dense underbrush. Her thoughts raced, trying to remember the layout of the forest and the way she had come. She hoped to find a familiar landmark or a hint of the main trail, but every direction seemed identical, the trees forming an impenetrable maze around her. Minutes felt like hours as she trudged through the forest, the growl now replaced by an eerie silence. Ellie's mind began to play tricks on her, shadows morphing into shapes and the rustling leaves sounding like whispers. She shook her head, trying to dispel the fear that was clouding her judgment. Suddenly, she stumbled into a small clearing. In the middle stood a solitary tree, larger and older than the others, its gnarled branches reaching out like twisted fingers. At the base of the tree, she noticed a small makeshift campsite, an old fire pit, surrounded by stones, and a few scattered belongings. Ellie approached cautiously, her eyes scanning the area for any signs of recent activity. The fire pit was cold, and the belongings were weathered and covered in dirt. She knelt down, examining an old backpack that lay partially buried in the ground. Inside, she found a few scraps of paper, including a torn map of the forest. Her hands shook as she unfolded the map, hoping it would lead her back to the main trail. The map was old and faded, but she could make out some landmarks that matched her surroundings. She traced her finger along the path she thought she had taken, realizing that she was further off course than she had imagined. A rustling noise snapped her back to reality. She looked up, scanning the edges of the clearing. The feeling of being watched returned, more intense than before. Ellie grabbed the map and the backpack, deciding it was time to move. As she turned to leave the clearing, she heard a low, familiar growl. Her heart raced as she backed away slowly, her eyes fixed on the dark edge of the forest. The growl grew louder, closer. She couldn't see anything, but she could feel its presence, hidden in the shadows. Without thinking, Ellie turned and ran. She sprinted through the forest, branches whipping against her face, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she had to get away. The growl followed her, relentless and unyielding. She stumbled over roots and rocks, her fear propelling her forward. Just when she thought she couldn't run any longer, she burst out of the dense forest and onto a narrow dirt road. Relief washed over her as she recognized the road from earlier that morning. She had found her way back. Ellie didn't stop running until she reached her car, parked at the trailhead. She fumbled with her keys, her hands shaking, and finally managed to unlock the door. She threw herself inside, locking the doors behind her. Her chest heaved as she tried to catch her breath, her eyes scanning the dark forest for any sign of movement. For a moment, the only sound was the pounding of her heart. Then slowly, the normal sounds of the forest began to return, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Whatever had been following her was gone. Ellie took one last look at the forest before starting her car and driving away. As she sped down the road, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had narrowly escaped something sinister. The forest, once a place of solace, had become a place of fear and mystery. She vowed never to hike alone again, especially not on an unfamiliar trail. The memory of the growl and the feeling of being watched would haunt her for a long time to come. But she was safe now, and that was all that mattered. Tom tightened the laces on his hiking boots and glanced at the dense forest ahead. The brochure had promised breathtaking views and a serene atmosphere, but now, standing at the edge of the trail, the forest seemed to whisper secrets. He shrugged off the unease and stepped forward, the crunch of gravel underfoot the only sound. An avid hiker, Tom had taken many solo trips, but something about this trail felt different. He chalked it up to the stories he heard in the nearby town. Rumors of hikers who had ventured in, but never came out. Urban legends, he muttered to himself, shaking his head. The first few hours were uneventful. The trail was well marked, and the forest was indeed beautiful. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting dappled shadows on the ground. Birds chirped, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves. Tom found himself relaxing, enjoying the tranquility. Around midday, he reached a small clearing and decided to take a break. He sat on a fallen log, pulled out a sandwich, and took a long sip from his water bottle. As he ate, he noticed an old weathered signpost at the edge of the clearing. The paint was peeling, but he could just make out the words. Old Mill, 2 miles. Curiosity piqued, Tom decided to check it out. He'd never heard of an old mill on this trail, and it wasn't on any of the maps he'd seen. He packed up his things and headed in the direction the sign indicated. The path was narrower and less traveled, overgrown with brambles and thick underbrush. As he walked, the forest grew denser and the light dimmed. The once cheerful birdsong was replaced by an eerie silence. Tom's unease returned, stronger this time. He pushed forward, determined to find the mill. After what felt like an eternity, the trees thinned, and he found himself standing in front of an old, dilapidated building. The mill, if it could still be called that, was in ruins. Its walls were crumbling, and the roof had caved in long ago. Weeds and vines crawled over the structure, reclaiming it for the forest. Tom approached cautiously, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. He peered inside, but the interior was too dark to make out any details. A sense of foreboding washed over him, but he ignored it, driven by curiosity. He stepped inside, the wooden floor creaking under his weight. He explored the main floor, finding nothing but debris and decay. As he was about to leave, something caught his eye, a staircase leading down into the darkness. He hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to turn back, but his curiosity got the better of him. He switched on his flashlight and descended the stairs. The basement was musty and damp. The beam of his flashlight revealed old machinery, rusted and covered in cobwebs. He moved slowly, scanning the room, when his light fell on something that made his blood run cold. There in the corner was a small makeshift bed, a dirty mattress with a thin, ragged blanket. Tom's mind raced. Who would be living down here? He scanned the room again, his flashlight trembling in his hand. That's when he saw it, a small notebook lying on the bed. He picked it up and flipped through the pages. The handwriting was messy, almost frantic. The entries were dated, some as recent as a few days ago. The notes were a jumble of thoughts, paranoid and disjointed. They spoke of them watching, of not being able to escape. The final entry sent a chill down his spine. They know I'm here. They come at night. I can't hide forever. Tom dropped the notebook, his heart pounding. He needed to get out of there. As he turned to leave, he heard a noise, a soft rustling, like someone moving in the shadows. He froze, holding his breath. The noise came again, closer this time. He bolted up the stairs, not daring to look back. He burst out of the mill and ran, not stopping until he reached the main trail. His mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Who had written those notes? And more importantly, who, or what, was them? As he hurried back toward the safety of his car, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The forest no longer felt peaceful. It felt menacing, alive with unseen eyes. Tom quickened his pace, the sense of dread growing with every step. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, following him. The trail seemed to stretch on endlessly, and the once familiar landmarks looked strange, twisted. Panic began to set in. He needed to get out of the forest now. Finally, after what felt like hours, he saw the parking lot through the trees. Relief flooded over him, but it was short-lived. As he neared his car, he noticed something that made his heart drop. There on the hood was a single muddy footprint. Tom's mind raced as he stood frozen, staring at the footprint. It was fresh, the mud still wet, and far too large to be his own. He quickly scanned the area, but saw no one. With trembling hands, he unlocked his car and got in, locking the doors behind him. He fumbled with his keys, finally managing to start the engine. As he drove away, he kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone, or something, emerging from the forest. The road twisted and turned, and every shadow seemed to hide a threat. He drove straight to the nearest town and checked into a small motel, too shaken to make the trip home in the dark. In the safety of his room, he tried to calm down and make sense of what had happened. He pulled out his phone and searched for any information about the old mill and the strange notes he found. His search turned up little, just a few mentions of the mill's history, and some vague rumors about disappearances in the area. Frustrated, he decided to get some sleep and figure things out in the morning. Sleep did not come easily. His mind kept replaying the events of the day, and every creak and groan of the motel seemed amplified in the quiet of the night. Finally, exhaustion took over, and he drifted into a restless sleep. He woke early the next morning, the events of the previous day still fresh in his mind. Determined to find some answers, he headed to the local library. He spent hours combing through old newspapers and records, piecing together the mill's history. The mill had been abandoned for decades, ever since a series of mysterious accidents had claimed the lives of several workers. There were rumors of foul play, but nothing was ever proven. Over the years, it had become a place of local legend, with stories of ghosts and strange happenings. But none of that explained the notebook or the footprint on his car. Tom's search for answers only seemed to lead to more questions. As he left the library, he felt a growing sense of unease. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Deciding to confront his fears, he made his way back to the trail. This time, he was prepared. He carried a small backpack with supplies and a sense of determination. He needed to find out what was going on, even if it meant facing whatever or whoever was in that forest. As he neared the mill, he felt the familiar chill of fear. The building looked even more foreboding in the daylight. He steeled himself and stepped inside. The basement was just as he had left it, but now in the daylight, he could see more clearly. He examined the machinery in the makeshift bed, looking for any clues he might have missed. Then he noticed something, a small hidden compartment in the wall. With some effort, he pried it open and found a bundle of old letters and photographs. The letters were from a man named Samuel, addressed to his family. They spoke of his work at the mill, but as Tom read further, they took a darker turn. Samuel wrote about strange occurrences and how he believed the mill was cursed. The final letter was the most chilling. Samuel wrote that he had discovered something terrible and that they were after him. The photographs were equally disturbing. They showed the mill workers, but in the background of some, there were shadowy figures, barely visible. Tom's heart pounded as he realized the figures matched the descriptions in the notebook. As he was examining the photographs, he heard a noise from upstairs. Someone, or something, was in the mill with him. He quickly gathered the letters and photos, stuffing them into his backpack. He switched off his flashlight and pressed himself against the wall, trying to stay hidden. The footsteps grew louder, descending the stairs. Tom's breath caught in his throat as a figure emerged from the darkness. It was a man, disheveled and wild-eyed, holding a flashlight. He looked around, his gaze passing over Tom's hiding spot. "Who's there?" the man called out, his voice shaking. "I know you're here. They sent you, didn't they?" Tom stayed silent, barely daring to breathe. The man moved closer, his flashlight sweeping the room. Just as he was about to reach Tom's hiding spot, a loud crash echoed from upstairs. The man whirled around and ran back up the stairs, shouting incoherently.